Good morning. I'm going to start with the central nervous system today. I'm in a new room, so you may see me, you may just see my hand sort of wave into the camera. I'm in a different room over on the main campus today, so things are not ideal, but we'll get the message. You can hear my voice, and at any time that I think you need to see me, I'll step into frame so you can see me. So the central nervous system, abbreviated as the CNS, includes the brain and the spinal cord. It plays a role in movement, uh, interpreting sensory information, those things like hot and cold and touch and those kinds of things. Works to maintain homeostasis, plays a role in heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, those kinds of things, and functions relating to the mind, those things that give us the ability to think and to reason and other things like that. That's the central nervous system. The functions of the nervous system, again, two basic groups of functions. There are those motor functions, the stimulation of muscle contractions or gland secretions. These are functions of a component of the central nervous system called the peripheral nervous system. Again, it's abbreviated the PNS. And the sensory functions, this is the things that detect the sensations both inside and outside the body. This is also a function of the peripheral nervous system. And again, think of periphery as things sort of on the outside or the edge. The integrative functions, these are our decision-making processes. These are exclusive to the CNS, excuse me. These are our interpretation of sensory information. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it salty? Is it bitter? Planning and monitoring movement. I'm going to get up and walk across the room and get the remote so I can change the channel on the television. Maintenance of homeostasis, again, that's controlling heart rate, blood pressure, and those kinds of things. And higher mental functions such as language and our ability to learn. The brain, first part of the central nervous system, is a soft, whitish gray organ. It is anatomically continuous with the spinal cord. It resides in the cranial cavity. It is either directly or indirectly controls most of your body's functions. The typical brain weighs between 1,250 and 1,450 grams. And if you think 454 grams in a pound, so you're looking at somewhere around 3 pounds or so for the typical human brain. It's made up of mostly nervous tissue, although there are some epithelial tissues that sort of help hold it in place. And then there are connective tissues which help hold it together. There are 4 cavities within the brain filled with cerebrospinal fluid. These are called ventricles, and we'll talk about the different ventricles a little bit later. The brain is going to receive approximately 20% of the total blood flow in the body at rest. So the brain receives a huge amount of blood. This reflects the requirements for huge amounts of oxygen, glucose, and nutrients. The ability of the cells in the brain to store nutrients is very, very limited. So it needs a continuous supply of nutrients. Hang on just a minute. I had a pop-up window show up on my screen. But there's a picture of the brain. If you'd have taken this course 15, 18 years ago, we would have said that the brain was divided into 3 divisions. We now divide the brain into 4 divisions. There is the cerebrum, which is by far the largest part of the brain. Let me find my pointer on this particular clicker. There's the cerebrum. The new part that's just been sort of carved out over the last, again, say 12 to 15 years, is the diencephalons. We always talked about the diencephalons. It was always mentioned, and it's always been a component ever since I've been doing this. But it's only recently that we've sort of started saying it's its own sort of independent part of the brain. The cerebellum is this part back here, sort of down on the bottom. And then this structure here, there's the spinal cord, there's the medulla oblongata, and this portion right here is the brain stem. The cerebrum is the large superior portion of the brain. It's divided into left and right cerebral hemispheres. Each hemisphere is further divided into 5 lobes. We'll talk about all of those lobes in just a moment. Each hemisphere contains groups of neurons that perform very specific tasks, and we will show that breakdown of the cerebrum, that this task is controlled by this part of the brain and this task is controlled by this part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that is responsible for our higher mental functions, such as learning, memory, personality, and cognitive thinking, things like language and conscience. These are major, also has major components for sensation and movement. This is the part of the brain that is larger in humans than it is as other animals. Again, as you move up that evolutionary ladder from the amphibians to the reptiles, from the reptiles to the mammals, and from mammals on up to humans, it's the cerebrum that tends to get larger. If you look at a comparative of brains, you'll see a very small cerebrum in, say, an alligator and a very large one in a human. The diencephalon lies underneath the cerebral hemisphere. It is the central core of the brain. It has 4 distinct structural and functional parts. We'll talk about those individually here in a few minutes. The diencephalon is responsible for processing, integrating, and relaying information to different parts of the brain. So it's sort of the switching center. A signal comes in, and the diencephalon says this signal needs to go here. And then the next signal comes in, and this signal needs to go there. Plays a role in homeostatic functions. Again, when you think of homeostasis, think about temperature, blood pressure, blood pH, all of those types of things. Regulating movement, the controlled movement, the manipulating of picking things up and putting things down. And then the biological rhythms. The biological rhythms in human beings are those things that control things like the sleep-wake cycle and the puberty cycle when you get to be a little older, and those types of things. The cerebellum is the posterior and inferior. Remember, posterior means back, inferior means toward the bottom. It is divided into left and right hemispheres. Heavily involved in planning and coordination of movement, especially complex activities, things like playing sports or playing a musical instrument. And when you think about the cerebellum, and when I was talking about the development of brains, and that humans have this really big cerebrum, but other animals don't. But other animals may have a very large cerebellum, because just because he's a tiger doesn't mean he's a stupid tiger. He's got to know how to hunt. So all of those things, planning, coordinating the movement, stalking, all of those things in a tiger would be controlled by the cerebellum. But if you know how to play a saxophone, that's part of the brain is the cerebellum for you. The brain stem connects directly to the spinal cord. It controls the basic involuntary homeostatic functions. Again, breathing and some other things like that are essential to life. If you think about things that have brains, every animal that has a brain is going to have a brain stem. Some animals, they basically are nothing more than brain stem. Other animals will have these other parts. But think about all the things that you have to do every day to keep you alive. Those are those functions. Control of certain reflexes. The gag reflex, for instance, is found in the brainstem. The swallowing reflex, found in the brainstem. Now, the muscles and nerves that control swallowing may be found elsewhere, but the stimulation for swallowing is found in the brainstem. The brainstem monitors movement and integrates and relays information from other parts of the nervous system. Again, this is where everything coming from outside the brain comes in. So it also plays a role in switching and sending things from place to place. Again, here is a larger view of the brain that we had a minute ago. Here, everything you see in this sort of taupe color is the cerebrum. The diencephalons is found underneath. To see the diencephalons, you take this large sulcus, and we'll talk about what a sulcus is here in just a moment, and sort of lift that one, and you can see the diencephalons. cerebellum back here on the back toward the bottom, and the brainstem is right in here. The spinal cord is a long tubular organ enclosed within the protection of the vertebral column, or it's found in the vertebral cavity formed by the vertebral column. It blends with the inferior portion of the brainstem. Jump back. Here's the spinal cord, where the spinal cord and the brainstem merge in that area. It ends between the first and second lumbar vertebra. It again is 43 to 46, 17 to 18 inches in length, depending on the person. Naturally, Shaquille O'Neal is going to have a much longer spinal cord than, I don't know, some shorter person that I can't think of right off the top of my head, but Danny DeVito. If you don't know who Danny DeVito is, Google him. So they both have a spinal column or spinal cord, but Shaquille O'Neal is 7 foot tall, so his is going to be significantly longer than Danny DeVito's is, and Danny DeVito is like 5'1" or something like that. Central cavity, again, it ranges from 0.65 to 1.25 or a quarter to a half an inch in diameter. The central canal is the internal cavity within the spinal cord. It is continuous with the brain's ventricles, and it is filled with cerebrospinal fluid as well. So the cerebrospinal fluid is in the central canal of the spinal column, or spinal cord, excuse me, and in the ventricles of the brain. The white matter, brain and spinal cord both are made up of two different types of tissue. There's the white matter, is found both in the brain and the spinal cord. The white matter consists of myelinated axons, and remember we talked about myelination in the last chapter. That's that insulating layer around the different components of the nervous system, around the axons, and it has fat in it, which gives it this sort of white appearance. Each lobe of the cerebrum contains bundles of white matter. These are referred to as tracts. They receive input from and send output to clusters of cell bodies and dendrites in the cerebral gray matter. And we'll talk about the gray matter in just a second. The spinal cord also contains white matter tracts. These shuttle information processed by the nuclei in the spinal gray matter. The gray matter is also found in both brain and spinal cord. These are neuron bundles, neuron bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. Since they do not have that fat-containing myelin sheath, they do not have the white appearance. The outer few millimeters of the cerebrum is gray matter. Deeper portions of the brain are mostly white matter, with some gray matter scattered throughout. We'll see a cross-section of brain here in just a few moments. The spinal cord is mostly gray matter. In the cord center, processes information, surrounded by tracts of white matter on the outside, relay information to and from the brain. So, again, gray matter, the outer few millimeters. So for the brain, the white matter is the common thing. For the spinal cord, gray matter is the common. Communication between the gray and white matter connects different regions of the brain and spinal cord to one another. The myelinated axons enable near instantaneous communication between locations. It does not take you long from the time you grab the hot pot handle till you know that it's hot and you let it go. That is almost instantaneous. It's milliseconds that it takes that. And that's because of the gray and white matter connections. Organization of gray and white matter in brain and spinal cord is reversed, as I mentioned before. The spinal white matter is superficial, while it is deep. The spinal cord white matter is on the outside or superficial, while in the brain it's deep or on the inside. And there's the cross section. Don't see these colors very well, but the darker here, you follow this all around, following all the folds and dips and everything. That's the gray matter. This lighter color that's in much more abundance is the white matter. Here's a cross-section of the spinal cord showing the white matter on the outside, the gray matter on the inside. Human beings are sexually dimorphic creatures. We all know that. There are differences in physical characteristics between males and females. Those physical differences go beyond just the reproductive system. They fit almost every system. Muscle mass is different in males and females. So we are very dimorphic. And for many, many years, scientists have been trying to prove the existence of what is referred to as a male brain and a female brain. Researchers have found differences between the brains of men and women. Men, on average, have higher visual spatial intelligence, whereas women, on average, have higher verbal, emotional intelligence. Again, pay close attention to the phrase "on average" here. This simply means that most males, the average male, is going to be more inclined and have a more, innate ability to perform visual or spatial things, aka science and engineering, than women, whereas women are going to be more innately drawn or innately able to have those verbal and emotional skills. That is not to say men cannot be wonderful artists and write wonderful love poetry, and women can't do complex calculus equations and design bridges. Just because you have the innate intelligence doesn't mean you can't learn things. Personal opinion, I think a lot of it is what are you exposed to at a very early age. When you are developing, when you're 15 months old until you're 3 or 4 years old, what are you exposed to? Well, traditionally in this country, we gave our little boys trucks and electric trains and those kinds of things to play with, and we gave our girls dolls, and our girls played house, and our boys went out and in my day played war. Yeah, I know that's not, we don't do that nowadays, but I think a lot of it is what you are raised with. As you all know, I have a 3-year-old at home that we've adopted. She is going to be exposed to everything early in life. She's going to be exposed to poetry. She's going to be exposed to music, but she's also going to be exposed to math and science. She is not going to grow up scared of mathematics, like so many, my wife included, young girls have been over the last 40 or 50 years. One of the worst commercials for a product in the world came out 30 or 40 years ago when Barbie came out and said that she was afraid of math. I can assure you, my little Lindy will not be afraid of math. Evidence strongly suggests that this is due to what is referred to as neuroplasty. Socialization influences the development of neural networks. I think I just said that. Engaging in sports or building activities encourage developments of visual spatial skills. Participating in imaginative play fosters verbal emotional skills. So in addition to taking dance lessons or drama lessons, my little girl is going to have Lego blocks, and she's going to be building things. And we're going to get, when she gets a little older, we're going to buy Lego kits, and we're going to build things and tear them down and put them, we're not going to glue them together. We're going to build them, tear them down, and build them again. And see if we can, the second time we build them, if we can build them quicker. When we test the very young, sex differences in visual, spatial, and verbal emotional intelligence become statistically insignificant. I think I just said that. Other data used to support this hypothesis of brain sex include MRI studies appearing to show vastly dissimilar brain maps in males and females. When these maps are corrected for size discrepancies in the male and female brain, the differences virtually disappear. So an area lights up in a male brain and lights up in a female brain, and we go, oh, look, it's bigger in the female brain. But then we go, oh, the female brain is also 20% smaller than the male brain, so it stands to reason that lit up area would be smaller in the males. Long been held that the hippocampus is larger in females than in males, which accounts for the women's higher emotional intelligence. Recent analysis, however, of over 80 studies found no significant size difference between the male and female hippocampus. Development within the central nervous system. The brain and spinal cord develop from a tube with an enlarged end. This occurs during the embryo stage, leading into the fetal stage. The first structure to form is something called a neural tube, which is a hollow tube from which the nervous system develops. Excuse me. It's completely developed by the 4th week of gestation. If this tube never forms, more than likely the baby will never be born. If the baby is born, it will be severely affected. The caudal end, caudal refers to tail. So this is going to be the far end of the neural tube, forms the spinal cord. The cranial end forms the 3 sac-like structures, the primary brain vesicles, which include the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. We'll talk about each one of those here in just a moment. The cavity within the neural tube becomes the ventricles in the brain and the central canal in the spinal cord. The primary brain vesicles will then give rise to 5 secondary brain vesicles by the 5th week of development. These secondary brain vesicles will create the 4 divisions of the mature brain. The forebrain expands into 2 secondary brain vesicles, the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The 2 lobes of the telencephalon will become the cerebral hemispheres. The diencephalon retains its name in the mature brain. The other secondary brain vesicles, the midbrain expands into the secondary brain vesicle called the mesencephalon, which will ultimately develop into the mature midbrain. The hindbrain develops into 2 secondary vesicles, the metaencephalons and the myelencephalons, both of which will develop the remainder of the brain stem. And the metaencephalon also matures to become the cerebellum. So there is a view, artist's rendering of what the development. Again, these are not to scale, so don't think that the early embryonic fetal brain is that big. In fact, the fetus is not even that big. So you start with the neural tube. The neural tube will then develop into the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain will then develop into the telencephalons and the diencephalons. The midbrain here will become the mesencephalon, and then the hindbrain will develop into the metaencephalon and the myelencephalon. Then the telencephalon, this will become the cerebrum. The diencephalon remains what it is, it just matures. The mesencephalon becomes the brain, the midbrain. Where is it? Right here. The metaencephalon will become the brain stem and the pons. The pons is this little rounded structure right here. The metaencephalon will also become the cerebellum here. And then the myelencephalon will ultimately become the brain stem, also sometimes known as the medulla oblongata. All right, let's stop for there, and I will pick up with another video in a little while.